Everyone, thank you for joining the conference call. I'm just going to wait an extra couple of minutes to give a few other people to join the call, but we'll be starting very shortly. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. I'll now begin the conference call. Hopefully earlier today you received the slides that we'll be going through, but also you should be able to see the slides on the screen, and I'll be pointing out things as we go along. As in previous conference calls, please feel free to write in with questions. The chat is sort of moderated, so whatever you write won't be visible to everyone else. So if you have a question that you want to ask anonymously, then please go ahead and do so. But I will wait till the end to go through all of the different questions. I hope that's not a problem. But I aim to talk for around 25 to 30 minutes and then have plenty of time for questions at the end. I wanted really today to focus on the outlook for monetary policy, given that we have seen quite a big shift in markets' interest rate expectations over the last 3 months or so. I think you can see that relatively clearly in this first chart, which shows you that markets now only see around a 50% chance of a rate rise at all this year. So there's a 50-50 chance of just a singular 25 basis point increase in bank rate that is now priced in by the end of this year. And whereas going back 2 or 3 months, markets were pricing in nearly 2 hikes before the end of the year. 40 basis point increase in short rates was priced in just this time 3 months ago. So we've seen a fairly big shift in markets' interest rate expectations, and on the face of it, it's easy to see why markets have made such a big shift. The survey evidence have been particularly weak in recent months, as I'm sure you're aware. We've seen significant falls in the PMIs, for instance. They're now at their lowest levels since the immediate aftermath of the referendum in 2016. They're broadly consistent GDP growth of about 0.1% quarter on quarter in Q4. Now, they have had a tendency in the past to overstate the impact of political uncertainty or financial market developments on the economy. So you wouldn't want to take that 0.1% forecast literally. We're actually expecting a 0.2% increase, which is a little bit stronger and in line with the other survey evidence, which hasn't deteriorated quite as sharply as the PMIs. But still, that's clearly well below the MPC's estimate of the trend growth rate of the economy, which is about 0.4% quarter on quarter. So that's certainly, if the PMIs are anywhere near being right at the moment, they are consistent with the MPC really taking its foot off the accelerator, not even thinking about raising rates in the near term. And as you can see here on chart number 2, the PMIs have had a clear influence on the MPC's interest rate decisions in the past. They're actually much closer to easing territory than they are to hike territory at the present. What's more, the MPC is sensitive to the global kind of financial market backdrop. As you can see here, this shows you all 21 occasions in the past when the MPC has raised interest rates, and the level of FTSE relative to either 90 days previously or 365 days previously when they actually raised rates. And as you can see, on all of those past occasions, they hiked when the FTSE 100 was up in year-over-year terms, rather than at present we're down about 10% year-over-year. So again, the MPC does take into account financial market conditions. It doesn't want to be completely controlled by financial markets, but nonetheless, it has shown in the past that it has been sensitive to that. And one of the reasons why the MPC delayed raising rates earlier this year from May to August was partly weaker GDP data, but also because there was a bit of a sell-off in equity markets at the start of last year as well. So certainly you wouldn't want to discount the fact that it will take some account of that we've seen a sell-off in markets in recent weeks. And finally, another reason to think that recent developments have reduced the chances of a rate hike coming is the fact that CPI inflation now looks to be below 2% throughout 2019. So this just shows you, this chart here, number 4, shows you our latest forecast for CPI inflation. And as you can see, we expect the headline rate to be well below 2% right from the start of 2019. So we're currently at 2.3% for November, but because we've seen such a sharp fall in the oil price over the last month or two, energy's contribution to inflation is set to decline quite sharply. Also in January, Ofgem is set to introduce a price cap on standard variable tariffs that should subtract about 0.2 percentage points from headline inflation. And at the same time, we're also seeing core goods inflation continue to decline, given that the exchange rate has broadly been stable over the last year or so. Core goods inflation is trending back down to more normal rates of around 0. So against that backdrop, again, it's quite easy to see why markets have been discounting chances of a 2019 rate hike altogether. I think that it's worth backtracking just a little bit and starting with what the MPC was trying to tell us back in November, only 2 months ago, when already markets had sold off a bit and the inflation outlook had also declined. And back in November, the MPC was quite clearly indicating that markets were underestimating the pace at which they thought it would be necessary to raise interest rates over the next 2 to 3 years. They showed that quite clearly with their forecasts for both GDP growth and inflation. So in particular, they expected GDP growth to be above trend throughout the next 3 years, and therefore for some excess demand to emerge by the end of the forecast, because they think that there's very little spare capacity in the economy left now. As you can see here, throughout 2018, the MPC was consistently upgrading its forecast for this excess demand forecast, and in November actually expected excess demand to start to emerge as soon as this year, on the assumption that it increased interest rates only at the pace that had been anticipated by markets in the run-up to the November meeting. And since then, not all developments have been negative and suggesting that growth is going to slow over the next couple of quarters. In particular, in the budget held just in the run-up to that MPC meeting, which they didn't have time to take account of, the Chancellor significantly changed fiscal policy for this year. As you can see here, fiscal policy is now set to be a slight boost to the economy in 2019, rather than a drag as had been previously planned. In time, the MPC estimates that the fiscal boost there will boost demand by 0.3% by the end of their forecast, with most of that boost coming through early on in the period. As you can see here, this is a significant change from pretty much grinding austerity for the last 8 or 9 years. At last, there's fiscal policy set to be a bit of a tailwind for the economy rather than a consistent headwind. Now, if you do a purely mechanical exercise and try and incorporate that extra fiscal boost into the MPC's projections in November, you actually start to see quite a sharp profile for bank rate over the next couple of years. So chart 7 here just shows you, first of all, the blue line shows you the path for interest rates that markets expected in November 2018, and how approximately just over 2 rate hikes were priced in for the next 3 years. The black line there shows you what would happen, well, what the MPC thinks the path bank rate would have to follow if it was actually to try and mechanically hit the 2% target for inflation in 2 years' time. Because on its November forecast, it actually anticipated that because of this excess demand emerging, because interest rates were already so low, inflation actually would be consistently above the 2% target throughout the next 3 years. So based on the Bank of England's model, if you just try and incorporate the extra tightening that would be required to make sure that inflation was at 2% in 2 years' time, you get the black line, which is effectively one further increase in bank rate over the next 3 years. Then if you add on to that as well the fiscal stimulus that the bank that was announced by the Chancellor, then you get the green line there, which again is effectively like a further 15 basis point increase in interest rates over the next 3 years that would be required. Now, if you couldn't, and the MPC must feel that it has to respond to this extra fiscal stimulus by upping the pace of monetary tightening because it thinks that there is no spare capacity left. So if unchecked, that small fiscal boost would actually create some inflation. So as you can see, there's a pretty big difference now between the green line, which is what the MPC would have in its head in November, or would have in its head now had nothing really changed apart from the fiscal boost, and the orange line there at the bottom, which is now markets' current expectations. A really big gap there. And I think it's questionable whether recent developments on balance have actually been severe enough to suggest that the MPC will have fully brought its view round to what markets are now currently pricing in. And going back to those arguments that we went through at the start for why the markets have brought down their interest rate expectations, I think we can dismiss most of those as not being really strong constraints on the MPC's behaviour. And so if you look at chart 8 here, this shows you actually the rate of current inflation at all those past occasions when the Bank of England has raised interest rates in the last 20 years. And on all but one of those occasions, core inflation has been below the 2% target. That is to say that the current rate of inflation at the time the MPC decided to raise the rates actually was below the 2% target. Throughout the 2000s, the MPC was hiking interest rates, despite the fact that the headline rate was consistently below 2%, because it feared that if it didn't, in time, inflation pressures would emerge from the labour market. And those concerns are likely to be just as strong today, given that we've now started to see a pickup in wage growth come through in the data. See, not all data surprises since the November MPC meeting have been to the downside, although the PMIs have deteriorated and official GDP data have also been quite weak. We have started to see this inflation pressure now build in the labour market. As you can see here, year-over-year growth in average weekly wages, excluding bonuses, picked up to 3.3% in October, which is the strongest rate we've seen since 2008. And this recovery in wage growth has occurred without any associated improvement in productivity growth. So this is soon going to be starting to filter through to firms' unit wage costs and therefore be starting to boost domestically generated inflation. And this is something actually that the MPC tried to signal in its December meeting and in the minutes of its meeting then, by pointing to a firming up of domestically generated inflation that was occurring a bit faster than they had actually expected in November. Now, I think it's unlikely that the wage growth is going to step up much more from where we are now. In particular, wage growth, wage contracts are negotiated with reference to inflation in the previous year, and now that we've seen a fallback in inflation, I think the negotiated wage settlements will also start to soften. But nonetheless, I think the Bank of England will be concerned that they've definitely reached a point where if there's any further erosion of slack in the labour market, it's going to lead to some sustained inflation pressure. If you look at chart 10 here, you can see that there's now evidence that the Phillips curve isn't dead or it's not flat, but it's actually starting to look quite steep. So this just plots wage growth against the unemployment rate and how over the last year we've seen relatively little absorption of labour market slack, but quite a big pickup in wage growth come through. And that perhaps suggests that we're starting to get to that point of the Phillips curve that is actually quite sharply upward sloping. This is consistent with reports from firms that they're finding it very hard to fill vacancies at present. Now, we have seen a bit of a softening in indicators of employment growth recently. So chart 11 just shows that here, with the composite employment balance from the market SIP survey showing the blue line. That tends to be quite a good leading indicator for growth in employee numbers. But whilst we have seen some deterioration, it certainly hasn't been that dramatic, not as significant as the deterioration in the headline PMIs, for instance. They're still consistent broadly with growth in employment of around 1% year over year, or perhaps a bit slightly below that now with the December reading there. But that's still consistent with a slight fall in the unemployment rate over the coming year, given that workforce growth tends to oscillate between 0.5 and 0.8%. So we're not at the point where the labour market slack is starting to increase again, even though we've seen quite a sharp slowdown. And if there are some good reasons, I think there are, to think that the slowdown that we've seen recently is temporary, then employment growth likely will pick back up again soon, and the unemployment rate still will keep grinding ever slightly lower, in which case that wage growth pressure will at least remain as strong as it is now. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that relative to other central banks, the MPC has been dragging its feet with monetary tightening, at least given the position of the labour market, which is historically very tight right now. So chart 12 just plots real interest rates for the G10 economies against the difference with the current unemployment rate and its long run average. And as you can see, the tightest labour market compared to past form is the US labour market with extremely low unemployment there. And as we know, the Fed has responded to that by pushing through a series of interest rate increases. By contrast, if you look at the UK, we're still seeing a very tight labour market by historical standards, but yet still real interest rates sharply negative. I would not want to, for a minute, suggest that there is a strong relationship here. Clearly, there are other factors at play here as to why different central banks are and should be keeping interest rates at different levels, and not just referring to the labour market slack per se. But certainly, with regard to the position of the labour market, the position of the UK economy in the cycle, interest rates look extremely low, and Britain looks like an outlier amongst the G10 economies there. And clearly, obviously, the reason why the MPC is being cautious has been due to Brexit. But were some clarity there to emerge, I think we'd start to see. I think the MPC would feel that it needed to now start to up the pace of tightening to bring itself back into line with what we've seen in other economies. Now, as I showed earlier, the MPC is sensitive to what happens in financial markets, but I think it may only result in a short pause rather than a fundamental reassessment of where it thinks interest rates need to go over the next few years. That's because I don't think on this occasion the fall in equity prices is signaling a severe slowdown in the economy. Yes, growth is weak right now, but I don't think we're heading for contraction in UK GDP over the next couple of quarters. And as you can see here, there's a relationship between equity prices and GDP growth has actually been quite weak in the past. There have been multiple occasions in the past where equity prices have been down 10, 15, 20% year over year, and yet that hasn't led to a recession in the UK economy, with the most notable example there being in the 2000s when, at its worst, equity prices were about 50% below their 2000 level peak, and yet the economy continued along, growing quite quickly. And alongside recent developments in markets, the fall in the oil price will filter through to boosting consumers' real incomes and therefore helping to strengthen the UK economy and therefore lead to further absorption of domestic slack in the economy. So on this occasion, I don't think the MPC is going to be too concerned by the recent sell-off in equity prices that we've seen. And finally, if we look at chart 14, I think this is actually quite striking, a point that's underappreciated right now. Is that so far, although the MPC has increased interest rates by 50 basis points since the low of 0.25% in 2016, we have still yet to see any real effective tightening of monetary policy in the real economy. That's because there have been plenty of households and firms that have been able to refinance old loans at ever cheaper interest rates. So as you can see here, the black line there is the effective interest rate on new mortgages that are being loaned out at that time. And as you can see, there's been a very modest increase in new mortgage rates since the second half of 2017. That has meant that if you were someone who took out a mortgage 3, 4, 5 years ago and they're coming to refinance that loan right now as you reach the end of your fixed rate period, you can make a substantial saving on your interest payments. And therefore, the effective interest rate on the outstanding stock of debt, shown by the blue line there, has continued to fall and will continue to fall unless the MPC does something about it. Because as you can see, the black line on the effective rate on new mortgages is still below the effective rate on the outstanding stock of mortgages. The gap has narrowed a bit, so it's not the blue line won't fall as quickly as it has done over the last few years. But nonetheless, there's still not been any real effective tightening of monetary conditions yet in the economy. And this chart looks probably the same if you look at corporations as well. Both households and firms have continued to benefit from falling credit costs. So the process of just raising rates once over the next year won't actually lead to any increase in or any reduction of stimulus in the economy. Really, they need to think about raising interest rates once every 6 months or so to actually start to bring about an increase in the blue line that starts to take some of the heat out of the economy. Now, of course, the whole economic outlook at the moment is still very contingent upon Brexit and what path politicians eventually decide to go down. And it's important to note that with the MPC's forecast in November, it was assuming an orderly transition to an average state of all possible Brexit outcomes that it thought were plausible. In a very long transition with not really any immediate upfront economic costs coming through. And clearly there are some risks to the downside. There's still a small but persistent chance of a no-deal Brexit. But I think taking a cold look at the numbers, it's much more likely that the government will either by choice or be compelled to opt for a softer form of Brexit. And that in turn will also strengthen the case for the MPC to press ahead with some additional rate hikes. So this table here just shows you how MPs said they were intending to vote on the withdrawal agreement in mid-December, just before the Prime Minister decided to delay the vote. And since then, we've seen no change in the substance of the withdrawal agreement. Only one MP has said that they've actually changed their minds and now will start to vote for the withdrawal agreement. So no real change in from what we can see in terms of MPs' voting decisions. So this should still be a pretty good guide to how MPs are likely to vote on Tuesday. And as you can see, there are only 183 MPs out of 639 actively voting MPs that say that they intend to vote for the withdrawal agreement on Tuesday. Of course, most of those are Conservatives, but there are a couple from other parties as well that said that they would support the government. That's clearly a long way short of the 320 MPs that you need if all MPs turn up and vote to actually get any legislation through Parliament. So unless there are some major amendments proposed in the run-up to that final vote on Tuesday that really turn things around, they'd have to be pretty substantial, I think, to actually ensure that there was a positive outcome coming through on Tuesday. It's much more likely that the Prime Minister is heading for a defeat and therefore has to consider what steps next to take. We learned earlier this week that she will now have only 3 sitting days in Parliament, which means that that takes you to the following Monday to present Parliament with alternative plans or inform Parliament how the government then intends to proceed, and then for MPs to effectively have their say and vote on lots of different options for Brexit. So this following table sets out, I think, the key Brexit scenarios that could follow. I think it's still likely that we will see a negotiated form of Brexit rather than Brexit being reversed altogether or there being a no-deal Brexit in March. But I think that it's very hard to be confident in any one particular scenario here playing out. Nonetheless, I think markets are too cautious in sort of overestimating the downside possibilities and underplaying the potential upside that could follow over the next couple of months. So the first option here really is that somehow miraculously the government actually gets through the current deal on January the 15th. As I said earlier, though, they only have 183 MPs that have pledged to publicly support the deal in its current form, and some amendments that have been proposed in the last couple of days that the government suggested it might actually start to take on board just don't seem to be substantial enough to really convert large numbers of MPs to supporting the deal. So then the Prime Minister has 3 more days to consider what next steps to take. I think it's much more likely that she will opt for a softer form of Brexit in order to try and get more and more Labour MPs to back the government's legislation than to tack to further harder form of Brexit to try and bring on side the waverers within her own party. That judgment is largely based on going back to the previous table, which is where you see at the bottom here a breakdown of the stances of people or of MPs who have said that they're going to oppose the withdrawal agreement by their position in the 2016 referendum. And as you can see here, of the 106 Conservative rebels, only 68 of them actually backed the Leave campaign in 2016. Now, adding that 26 on to the 183, they've already said that they're going to back the withdrawal agreement, doesn't get you to the 320 winning line. The far more significant block in Parliament right now is the 188 Labour MPs that backed Remain in 2016. If she can convert, 2/3 of those to voting for a much softer form of Brexit, then she has a good chance of getting something through Parliament. If she also softens her Brexit stance, then the 32 SNP MPs within Parliament could also potentially come on board. Maybe a few Liberal Democrats would as well. Now, by a softer form of Brexit, what I mean is a Norway Plus style arrangement where effectively the UK stays in the single market and also has a customs union, which again essentially preserves the status quo. Very little economic damage would actually be entailed by this option, and has already been proposed by Conservative figures within the Tory party. And now the main problem for Theresa May is that this continued single market access would entail allowing freedom of movement to continue. But I think public opinion has changed remarkably on this issue since 2016. Public cares a lot less about controlling immigration than it did at the time of the referendum. This chart just shows you the percentage of people that say that immigration is a top 2 issue facing Britain currently. And at the time of the referendum, nearly half the population actually said that immigration was a top 2 issue for the government to focus on. Over the last 2.5 years, we've seen a consistent fall in public concern about immigration, and now it's down to the lowest levels that we've seen since April 2002. If you were a strategist within number 10, you'd be saying that there's no point now in driving on with a hard Brexit that leads to economic pain merely to control immigration, because the public cares a lot less than it used to about it. And if you look at other surveys as well, you see a very clear trend in the last few months towards people thinking that actually Brexit was the wrong decision altogether in the first place. This is YouGov's poll, which has been conducted repeatedly since the 2016 referendum, and each bar here is the average of responses during the month. And the question is, in hindsight, was the UK right or wrong to vote to leave the EU? And for the first year or so after the referendum, you saw a consistent but small majority of people saying it was still the right decision to have left. But then as the economic consequences of Brexit started to filter through, it became clear that there wasn't a Brexit dividend for the NHS, and that we needed to, that the economy was weakened, and that therefore we needed to, our trade links were more valuable with the EU. We've seen quite a significant shift in public opinion, and now the percentage of people that say that it was actually the wrong decision outnumbers the people who still think it was the right decision to leave by 8 percentage points. That's a pretty big shift, and one that's really accelerated as well in the last couple of months. So again, if Theresa May really cares about the Conservative Party, she's not necessarily going to try and get those hardliners within her party on board, because that would go against the flow of public opinion right now and lead to the Conservatives ultimately losing a lot of seats in the next general election. Again, if you're a strategist within Number 10 and thinking after the defeat in Parliament next week, how we should respond, again, I think this is giving you a pretty clear message that the right political strategy there is to go for a much softer form of Brexit. And indeed, I think this is actually the only form right now that it would currently command the support of a majority of MPs in Parliament. As we saw earlier, a shift to a harder form of Brexit just doesn't have enough support in Parliament. Now, that's not to say that this shift can be made seamlessly. For a start, a lot of Labour MPs won't just suddenly jump on board with the government because they've shifted to a softer Brexit stance. There'll, of course, have to be some renegotiation of the withdrawal agreement and political declaration as well to try and make it clear that we would be heading for a soft Brexit and to make sure that the EU is completely on board with this. And Labour MPs are going to try and first of all precipitate a general election if they can, rather than go down this route. But I think once those other options have been exhausted, I think it's highly unlikely that the government is going to lose a confidence vote, because it's very much in Conservative MPs' interest to not have a general election right now when they would lose seats on current forecasts based on opinion polls. And also, the DUP is not going to give up its once-in-a-generation position of power and influence over UK politics by calling another referendum, by precipitating another election. It also has a strong financial interest in the status quo continuing. So I think the chances of a general election occurring in the next couple of months are still very slim. A second referendum is an option, I think, which you can't discount, but shouldn't be your base case. So if just going back to the top table here, I've given a second referendum and Brexit being reversed via this route a 30% chance, a bit less than the base case, which we just described earlier, a shift towards a Norway plus style Brexit. Now, on paper, the government has a majority of 13 MPs, so you only need 7 of them, 7 Conservative MPs to shift to the opposition to defeat it. And actually, we've seen 10 Conservative MPs that have currently said that they are backing the People's Vote campaign. So in theory, there could be enough MPs out there if all Labour MPs also voted for a second referendum. And the number of Tory defectors might actually grow as well after the withdrawal agreement is voted down. Just as a rough indicator, there are 15 Conservative MPs that hold seats where more than 60% of their constituents voted for Remain, and therefore they're under some pressure in their own backyard to reconsider the Brexit decision altogether. So if you did get Labour shifting after a failure to achieve a general election to a second referendum, then there are just about the numbers, I think, in Parliament for that to be possible. But it's not clear whether Jeremy Corbyn will make that shift. Labour still is divided on this issue. If there is going to be a shift, it will not occur in the next couple of weeks, I think, but further down the line, later on in Q1, when Mr. Corbyn is convinced that there is no other chance of bringing down the government, and that therefore a second referendum is the next best bet. And given what we've seen in opinion polls with a consistent, albeit small majority of people saying that they would actually vote to reverse the Brexit decision if they had the chance again, I think we could relatively safely assume that if there was another second referendum for Brexit, which is why I've given it a 30% probability, which is, I think, relatively high compared to market's expectations, in which case you would see the MPC really being given the green light to start to accelerate the pace of tightening, because their concerns about long-term trend growth would wash away, and therefore they'd think that the current level of interest rates is well below the real interest rate, the equilibrium interest rate that they need to get towards over the next few years. So going back to the base case, if we were to see that shift over the next few weeks towards a softer form of Brexit as the only possible one that could actually get through Parliament, then I think that strengthens the case as well for the MPC to be starting to raise interest rates at a faster rate, because clearly Brexit uncertainty has been affecting the economy. If we were to get a clearer shift towards a soft Brexit, firms would be able to plan much more for the longer term. If you look at chart 20 here, we've seen a downturn in business investment really come through in the last couple of quarters. Initially, after the Brexit vote, business investment was broadly stable, but as um, the Article 50 deadline in March has drawn ever closer, we've seen progressively faster falls in business investment, as you can see in this chart. And at the same time, in all other advanced economies since 2016, we've seen very strong growth in business investment. There's been a bit of a tailing off again in the last couple of quarters, but throughout 2016 and 2017, we saw particularly strong growth in business investment in the US and most European economies. So that reflecting the very strong case absent Brexit to be investing right now as well. That profit margins are generally very high, above their long run average currently in the UK. Capital is very low still, and most firms are now reporting that they're experiencing quite severe capacity constraints. So were it not for Brexit, I think investment really would be racing away. What instead has happened is that firms have been, as I said there earlier, been earning good profits, but they haven't spent that extra cash that they've been getting in. Rather, they've just been hoarding it on their balance sheets, as I think you can see in this following chart. It shows you that firms' cash holdings as a share and how it's been on a long-term rising trend for various reasons that we can go into another time. But really that upward trend has steepened since 2016 at the time of the Brexit vote. Firms have just been adding to their cash stockpiles at the moment. And this cash could very quickly be deployed in the event of some positive Brexit news coming through. If it's just a removal of a no-deal Brexit risk, or if it's a more concrete shift to a softer form of Brexit, has been the government's ultimate aim. Now, of course, there are other reasons why firms might be saving right now. In particular, firms in sectors that might lose out from a Labour government, still will be cautious, even if we do see a shift to a softer Brexit. But nonetheless, I think there is clear scope for some of that extra cash that is, earning a negative real return for firms to be spent right now in the event of a softer form of Brexit. Finally, it's likely that we would see some appreciation of exchange rate following a shift to a softer form of Brexit, that in turn would boost households' real incomes as you go into 2020, because import prices will be lower. It does take about a year for changes in import prices to really filter through to consumers and the prices that they pay in the shops. So it's a boost for 2020 rather than for the near term. But as the MPC is forward-looking, it will be becoming more concerned as well about the domestic overheating in the economy. Because although it would drive inflation lower, it's ultimately improving households' real incomes. They would spend some of that additional money on domestically used services instead, and therefore it would increase the risk that the economy overheats in the near term. So whilst we've generally been quite downbeat about the UK economy over the last few quarters, our forecasts going ahead are actually a bit stronger than the consensus. And we think that towards the end or the second half of 2019, we should be starting to see above trend growth rates. So as you can see here, the dotted line here is the MPC's estimated trend growth, which is around 1.5%. And we think we could easily be getting to much stronger rates towards the end of 2019 and into 2020, perhaps at around 2%. Now, that I think will be partly investment-led, as for the reasons we outlined earlier. And there are some people who argue that, well, because it's investment-led, that's enhancing the economy's supply side, and therefore it gives the MPC a bit more time as well before it needs to start raising interest rates, because that should boost productivity growth, and therefore underlying inflation pressures will be contained as a result. But I think the shift to the softer Brexit will also influence the MPC's estimates of trend growth, and therefore the ultimate level of interest rates that they need to target 3 to 4 years down the line. And therefore the required amount of tightening as well also increases. So whilst they perhaps have a little bit more leeway in the near term, ultimately they have to go much further than monetary tightening. And of course, that extra investment in the near term, the production, the construction of those extra buildings, extra machinery, for instance, creates inflation pressure in the near term. You don't get that boost to productivity growth filtering through until actually the new building comes online or new plant comes online That's for more for 2020. So in the near term, it actually probably helps to create some additional inflation pressure. So therefore, this period of stronger growth in demand coming through, I think the MPC will start to be upping the pace of tightening, and rather than just going for one rate hike every 12 months, as effectively what we've seen over the last 2 years, I think we'll be looking at 2 rate hikes within each 12-month period after we've got that clarity on Brexit. Now, I'm assuming that we do get a decisive shift from the government and everything is clear by the end of March. And the chance of that actually happening have increased in the last few weeks, given that earlier this week the government had to lost the vote, the Grieve Amendment, which forces them to set out their plans in the following week after a defeat on Tuesday. And there is only so much scope for Article 50 to be extended, given that there are European Parliament elections in May. That presents some real issues for the UK if it intends, and for EU administration if they want to preserve the possibility of the UK fully staying in the EU. So if we are to see an extension of Article 50, I think it will really be only for a couple of months. I don't think Europe has much patience for the UK at the moment. So my base case is that actually there is quite a strong case for the MPC to start raising rates in May, and that they proceed with rate hikes for every 6 months thereafter. And so I've penciled in 2 rate hikes for 2019 and 2 for 2020, which, whilst it is clearly above market's current rate expectations, it still would be consistent with the MPC's belief or its guidance that rate tightening will be gradual. As you can see on this final chart, all past tightening cycles have usually occurred at a pace of 125 basis point an increase, 125 basis point increase in bank rates every quarter. So one rate hike every 2 quarters, would still be gradual and still be leaving policy quite accommodative towards the end of 2020 as well. And of course, bank rate is not, as we highlighted earlier, is not what households and firms effectively are paying in terms of interest. They still got scope for that effective interest rate to continue to fall. What you need to see is 2 rate hikes every year in order to just stabilise at present the effective interest rate on the outstanding stock of mortgages. So just to sum up then in brief before I take questions, the MPC was signaling pretty clearly in November that it thought further rate hikes were needed, and that at the time markets were underestimating the pace at which rates needed to rise. And developments since that point have not been entirely to the downside. Whilst GDP growth has slowed a bit more than it anticipated, Q4 growth looks set to be about 0.2% quarter on quarter. We've also seen fiscal stimulus enacted, and wage growth has picked up faster than they expected as well. In addition, whilst inflation does look likely to be below the 2% target throughout 2019, and that's not what the MPC was expecting back in November, I don't think the committee will be changing its medium-term views about inflation still being slightly above the 2% target if they take their time over rate hikes as markets currently anticipate. And as we've seen in the past, the MPC has never been held back by a slightly below target current rate of inflation if it's concerned about the position of the labour market and wage growth. And whilst by historical standards wage growth is still very subdued, the fact that we have started to see a sharp pickup in the last 6 months or so will be influencing their consideration of balance of risks for the inflation outlook going forwards. Meanwhile, although equity markets have sold off and MPC has shown some sensitivity in the past, I think on this occasion you'll find that it doesn't actually need to be too concerned about the sell-off, and GDP growth shouldn't be adversely affected from that source. Of course, the whole economic outlook right now is very contingent on Brexit, but I think the only option for the government, if it wants to get anything through Parliament, is to opt for an EEA-style soft Brexit. And whilst a second referendum can't be the base case, I think there's still an outside chance of it occurring. So no-deal Brexit risk as well, I think, is generally overstated. I only see a 10% chance of a no-deal Brexit, given that the UK now has the unilateral power to defer or decide not to go over the cliff edge at the end of March. And there's been a very clear movement amongst MPs to do whatever it takes to stop that from actually being government policy. If we do get that shift to a softer Brexit, or if it's just that we have a further 2-year period of certainty, but with no clarity over the longer term outlook, I think there's still scope for some recovery in business investment to come through over the next few quarters, and that to push GDP growth a bit above its trend again. And given that the MPC has already been delaying raising interest rates again due to Brexit, I think a soft Brexit shift really will give them the green light to start increasing rates at a faster pace than they have done so far, while still keeping the rate hike pace gradual by past standards. So I think once we do have that Brexit deal in place, or the March deadline has been safely hurdled, then we should be looking at 25 basis point increases in interest rates coming every 6 months or so after that point. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Please write in with your questions if you have any. Also, if there's anything I haven't covered that you'd like to talk to me about in the next couple of days, please feel free to send me an email. We can chat soon. Okay, I've had one question on the reliability of YouGov survey that I pointed to earlier about what's under public opinion. Let's come back to this chart, which shows that shift in public opinion and sort of buyer's regret here, really, with now a clear majority of people saying that they think that the vote to leave the EU is the wrong decision. Of course, there's always a margin of error with polls. YouGov has been more right than most with its polling methodology. It actually was the only pollster to predict that there would be a hung parliament during the 2017 referendum, 2017 general election. So I think it has more credibility than most. It helps that this poll is being conducted repeatedly, normally 3 or 4 times a month, every month since the Brexit vote. Even if you think there are some reasons to think that it's perhaps underweighting certain types of voter, perhaps it's underweighting leavers who are harder to reach, that would change your assessment of the levels of support, but not the trend that we've seen over the last 2 years. And the errors really have to be huge right now to fully eradicate that 8 percentage point lead for preferring to remain in the EU. And I think finally the credibility of the poll is also strengthened by the fact that for the first year or so after the Brexit vote, it was giving you consistent results that were actually in line with the 2016 referendum as well. So I think this is more reliable than most polls out there, whilst clearly acknowledging that every poll has a margin for error. Okay, I also had a question about what we should expect the market impact to be from a Corbyn government. So I didn't have time to go through all the details on this table, but hopefully this does help you navigate the situation. As I said, I think it's unlikely that the government will lose a confidence vote if it's Corbyn in the next few weeks. It's unclear as well as to whether Labour will call that confidence vote the day after the government loses the vote on Tuesday, or whether it's likely to hold out a bit longer. Jeremy Corbyn today has been, hasn't tied his hands to any particular date for calling that vote. But let's just suppose that there is one, that the government does lose that confidence vote. Perhaps if it starts heading towards a no-deal Brexit, then there have been enough Conservative MPs out there that have already said that they would resign the Conservative Party whip in that event, and it's possible in that scenario that therefore there would be a confidence vote that was successful and led to a general election. I think market concerns about a Corbyn government are generally overstated. Clearly, he has radical policies, and we don't fully know what he would do if he had the chance. But just as Theresa May is constrained by the maths of Parliament, I think Corbyn would be too. If you look at current opinion polls, Labour has also fallen back from 2017 levels of support. If you had a general election today and you just translated those current opinion polls into reality in a kind of uniform national single model, you would have a hung parliament. Labour and the Conservatives would probably be just about the largest party, but Labour would probably have a decent chance of forming a government if it was prepared to be in coalition with, say, the SNP or the Liberal Democrats. But Jeremy Corbyn would have to water down his politics in order to form that coalition. The SNP wouldn't describe them as moderate, but are more moderate than Corbyn, and certainly Liberal Democrats would be a moderating influence. Their 20 or so MPs could well be enough to actually tip the balance in if current opinion polls are broadly right. And it's important to note as well that Jeremy Corbyn does not represent most the views of most Labour MPs either. He has been elected by the party membership, but the current crop of MPs largely do not back his form of politics. After in 2016, most MPs voted against him in a confidence vote, but he held on to the leadership of the Labour Party because it's decided by a one member, one vote policy, and the party membership was still strongly supporting him. But he would have to build coalitions, within his own party as well in order to get legislation through. And I think that would therefore mean that he would also have to move more towards the centre. So I think fears about the sort of socialist policies that might be introduced if Mr. Corbyn will actually get into power are overplayed. I'm sure there'll be a near-term sell-off in sterling and greater risk premium price into UK assets in the near term. But ultimately, I think he would be severely constrained. And finally, of course, there's a risk premium attached to sterling and all UK assets right now due to Brexit, and a shift to a softer form of Brexit under a Corbyn government, I think would lead to some softening of that market impact as well in the near term, from that fear that Corbyn will take the UK down a very socialist route. So actually, as you can see here on this table, number 16, I actually think sterling would be stronger than it is right now in the event of a Corbyn government. That's all against what most people think. But as I said, is that Corbyn will be constrained, and the shift towards a softer form of Brexit also will be comforting for some investors. I've had one question about immigration and whether the drop in concern that we saw in this chart is a function of Brexit just going ahead, and therefore people being less concerned about it, rather than people actually thinking it's less of a priority. Possibly true. What you can do, however, is plot this chart here against actual net migration numbers, and we saw a peak in net migration into the UK in 2015 that has since tailed off significantly, particularly from migration from the EU. So I think actually this is really reflecting what's happening on the ground, but we just aren't seeing the sheer numbers of migrants arrive in the UK like we did 3 or 4 years ago. That led to that heightened concern. This survey also tracks other issues, asks voters for whatever it is they think is a top 2 issue for the country, and you've seen clearer increases in concern about the NHS or funding of public services during this period. So I think the public mood has moved on since 2016, and that's a reflection of what's actually happened. Net migration has already cooled significantly, and it's become much clearer to people that there are real economic costs from leaving the EU, and that what's really shot up is concern, obviously concern about the outlook for Brexit and where it's heading. That's what's really taken off in the last 6 months if you look at this poll. Now, again, so what people mean by concern about Brexit is hard to disentangle, but as we saw back in this chart, we have seen that at the same time a clear shift in people saying that it's actually a wrong decision, suggesting that people are worried about the economic impacts of leaving the EU and some of the more softer losses as well, so general concerns about the UK losing influence globally. So I agree, it's necessarily hard to tell whether genuinely people are less concerned about immigration or whether they just think the government's going to sort it out now. But I imagine distrust in the government is fairly strong at the moment, given that we've already seen the UK government soften its form of Brexit considerably compared to what it was seeking a year or two ago, and just general distrust with the fact that they could ever meet the target that they have. I think this is more genuinely reflecting what's actually happening on the ground. I've had one other question about the inflation outlook and the risk that it might actually be stronger than expected. Just to recap, this chart shows you at the start that we think CPI inflation will be below 2% throughout 2019. Not massively so. I mean, the lowest point I think is likely to come towards the autumn, reading around 1.5%. When core goods inflation has fully fallen and no longer reflects a boost from the 2016 depreciation. As you can see in this chart, I have built in a pickup in domestically generated inflation, reflecting the fact that wage growth has picked up, productivity growth hasn't, and therefore wage costs are now starting to pick up. Nothing dramatic, but a definite firming in underlying inflation pressures. But it's picking up from still quite low levels historically. Services inflation on the current trends, current upward trend that we've seen over the last 6 months or so. It'd still take another 3 years before it got to rates that were consistent with a core inflation rate of 2% when you have core goods inflation trending around 0, which is its long-term average. Domestically generated inflation also doesn't tend to move sharply. In the past, we've seen gradual increases and gradual falls rather than dramatic increases at the pace of 12 months. And at least in the near term, the next couple of quarters, when the economy, I think, is still going to be struggling with Brexit uncertainty, firms are going to make it hard to make price rises stick. We've certainly been seeing that in the last a couple of months with retailers discounting and inflation falling a bit faster than most expected. So I would emphasize that the inflation forecast here already does incorporate some firming up in domestically generated inflation. There's certainly, I wouldn't want to underplay the risks of faster or higher domestically generated inflation there, given the pick of a wage growth we have seen and the fact that pick of a wage growth has occurred despite very little reduction in the labour market slack over the last year, suggesting that we are now at a sort of inflection point for the labour market where you really do start to see wage growth pick up if we do get any further fall in unemployment. So there certainly are risks to the upside there for domestically generated inflation, but it's always been a good bet recently to forecast just a gradual shift in that rather than a sudden acceleration. And as I said earlier, although wage growth has got up to just above 3% now, I don't think it's likely to shift higher, given that it tends to be somewhat lagging behind the current rate of inflation. So it hasn't yet reflected the fall in inflation that we've seen over the last 12 months. What really will be key is looking at pay settlements that are negotiated over the next few months, because around 40% of workers' salaries are set by collective wage bargaining in the UK, and most of those agreements, I think around 2/3 of them occur in the first 4 months of the year. So sort of outlook for wage growth is often baked in at the start of the year. So really looking at those negotiated pay settlements and to see whether they start to soften because not many of them are set with reference to inflation in the previous year, whether they stay at a high level will be will be worth watching. Are there any more questions? If not, I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. Okay, I think that's it then. I don't think there are any more questions outstanding. Please do get in touch though if you have any further questions by email or pick up the phone. I'll be very happy to discuss any issues that you think are outstanding. And I hope that presentation was useful.